Chains rattled in the dead of night, echoing against the wooden walls of a Virginia plantation. A scream split the darkness, high, sharp, unforgettable. The cotton master, feared by every slave, was found hanging grotesquely, his body swaying, his lifeless eyes bulging in terror. And the rope? It wasn't around his neck, it was tied cruelly to his testicles. His killer was no man, no overseer, but a frail albino slave woman named Miriam. And what led her here will shock you. The year was 1748. Virginia was the beating heart of the plantation South, a land drenched in sweat, blood, and cotton. The horizon stretched endlessly with fields of white fiber that shimmered under the cruel sun. But for those forced to harvest it, that whiteness was not purity, it was prison. Cotton was wealth for the masters, but chains for the enslaved. And within those chains lived one girl unlike any other, a girl whose very skin marked her as different, cursed, and yet unforgettable. Her name was Miriam. From the first breath she took, Miriam was a contradiction. Born in the cramped, foul-smelling slave quarters during the bitter cold of January, her arrival brought confusion and fear. Her mother, a strong African woman stolen from the Gold Coast, had been known for her deep ebony skin and proud bearing. But the child who slipped screaming into her arms that night was pale as parchment. Her hair was not black, but white as snow. Her eyes, when they opened, shimmered with a strange light, sensitive to the glare of fire and sun alike. The other slaves gasped and muttered in the darkness. Some said she was touched by spirits. Some believed she was cursed, a bad omen that would bring suffering. A few whispered that she was a sign from the ancestors, born to bring justice. But for Miriam's mother, there was no doubt this fragile pale child was her daughter, flesh of her flesh, and she would protect her, no matter the cost. Yet protection was nearly impossible in the world of the plantation. Word of the strange child spread quickly, and by morning, Master Edward Bransfield himself demanded to see her. Bransfield was a man of wealth and cruelty, owner of vast cotton fields and dozens of human lives. He was a man who thrived on control, who relished in reminding others of his power. When he saw Miriam's pale skin and white hair, he laughed. "A curiosity," he said, stroking his chin. "Not black, not white. Something in between. We'll make use of her." From that day on, Miriam was not just a slave, she was a spectacle. Unlike the other children, who were quickly sent to the fields as soon as their bodies were strong enough to carry loads of cotton, Miriam was kept inside the big house. Mistress Eleanor Bransfield, a cold and jealous woman, paraded her before guests like a circus oddity. "Have you ever seen the likes of this?" she would sneer. "A white-skinned African. Even God plays tricks." The guests laughed, pointing, sometimes even touching Miriam's pale skin as though she were some exotic pet. For a child, humiliation cut deep. Miriam longed to play freely with the other slave children, to run through the fields, to be invisible. But instead, she was always on display. The slaves themselves treated her with wary distance. Some believed being near her would bring punishment. Others mocked her, whispering names like ghost and spirit child. Even in her own community, she was an outcast. But isolation gave Miriam something powerful: silence and observation. While others sweated under the overseer's whip, Miriam moved through the house, listening, watching, remembering. She saw how Bransfield conducted business, how he locked his ledgers away, how he trusted no one. She saw how Mistress Eleanor pretended at piety in church on Sunday, while beating the maids on Monday. She noticed the ropes in the barn, the pulleys used to hoist heavy cotton bales, the cruel tools of discipline kept hidden in a chest by the overseer, Jonas Pike. Jonas Pike was a man who embodied the plantation's brutality. Thick-armed, scarred from drunken brawls, his eyes always glinted with violence. He took pleasure in reminding slaves of their place, calling them dogs, forcing them to bow lower, work harder, bleed more. He found special delight in tormenting Miriam. "Ghost girl," he would snarl, shoving her into the dirt. "Ain't no place for you in heaven or hell. Both sides would spit you out." When he drank, he'd lock her in the smokehouse, laughing at the way her pale skin seemed to glow in the moonlight streaming through the cracks. Miriam's childhood was marked not only by ridicule, but by terror. Inside the house, she became the target of Bransfield himself. He was a man of appetites, appetites he fed without care for consent. By the time Miriam reached her teenage years, Bransfield's eyes lingered on her too long. He cornered her in hallways, his breath thick with whiskey, his hands rough on her arm. She resisted, she screamed, but resistance only earned her harsher punishment. He would whisper in her ear, calling her his ghost girl, his special prize. Each violation carved hatred deeper into Miriam's heart. She was no longer just different, she was prey. And yet, with every assault, with every insult, with every night of humiliation, Miriam's spirit hardened. She learned to mask her rage with silence. She learned to survive not by breaking, but by waiting. By 16, Miriam had witnessed horrors most would not believe. She had seen men whipped until their backs were nothing but ribbons of flesh. She had seen women dragged screaming to the barn at night, emerging broken and sobbing at dawn. She had seen children snatched from their mother's arms and sold away, never to be seen again. And she had seen Master Bransfield boast of his order, bragging that no slave of his would ever dare rise against him. But Miriam was different. She was marked since birth, and deep inside her a voice whispered, "Your time will come." The spark that lit the fire came during a Christmas feast. On the Bransfield plantation, Christmas was not a celebration for the enslaved. It was a cruel performance, a masquerade where they were forced to sing, dance, and entertain the white guests. That year, the great hall was filled with candlelight, the smell of roasted goose, and the laughter of drunken men. The slaves were lined up, ordered to perform carols and African chants while the masters jeered. Miriam was singled out, forced to sing alone before the crowd. Her voice, though soft and trembling, carried sorrow that silenced the room for a moment. But when her tone faltered, Bransfield's face darkened. In front of everyone, he struck her across the face with the back of his hand. The sound echoed. The guests laughed. Eleanor smirked. Miriam stood frozen, her cheek burning, her humiliation complete. That night, lying on the cold dirt floor of the quarters, Miriam pressed her swollen face into her hands and wept. But her tears soon dried, replaced by something colder, sharper, resolve. That blow had broken something, not her, but the last thread of fear binding her spirit. She swore silently that she would never again allow herself to be just an object of ridicule. She would make Bransfield pay, not with words, not with cries, but with suffering so deep that it would stain the memory of his name forever. She began to plan. She remembered the pulleys in the barn. She remembered the knots on the ropes. She remembered how the overseer laughed about hanging a man by his manhood. The image seared itself into her mind. If death was the only freedom she would ever know, she would give Bransfield death, but not before giving him terror, humiliation, and pain beyond measure. And so, Miriam waited. She played her role. She lowered her head when ordered. She sang when commanded. She endured when touched. But behind her pale eyes, revenge grew, slow and certain, like a storm gathering on the horizon. What no one knew, not Bransfield, not Eleanor, not Jonas Pike, was that the girl they mocked as a ghost was preparing to become a nightmare. And the night she chose to strike would change everything. The Bransfield plantation was not merely a place of labor, it was a theater of suffering. Every day was choreographed cruelty, every hour designed to remind the slaves of their chains. Dawn began with the crack of Jonas Pike's whip. His voice carried across the cotton fields like thunder, barking orders, spitting insults, demanding more, always more. Men bent their backs until sweat poured like rain. Women balanced baskets heavy enough to break their spines. Children stumbled, forced to pluck cotton before they could even count their years. Jonas Pike lived for this power. He strutted through the rows with his whip coiled in his fist, daring anyone to falter. And when they did, he struck. Flesh split, cries filled the air, and blood stained the cotton. To him, each lash was music, each scream a song of obedience. Miriam, though kept within the big house, was never far from Pike's reach. He found opportunities to remind her that she was still a slave. Sometimes he would drag her into the yard, shoving her before the others, mocking her pale skin, her white hair. "Look at the ghost girl," he jeered. "Not fit for the fields, not fit for the house. She don't belong nowhere." Laughter followed, but behind Miriam's silence, a storm brewed. She endured the humiliation, storing it, feeding on it, shaping it into anger. Inside the house, life was no kinder. Master Bransfield was a man who demanded absolute control. His plantation was his kingdom, his slaves his subjects. He reveled in cruelty not just as discipline, but as entertainment. At dinners, he would force the kitchen slaves to stand silently along the walls while he feasted, occasionally throwing scraps on the floor for them as if they were dogs. During church on Sundays, he would stand tall in his pew, pretending at piety, while his slaves sat outside in the cold, waiting, listening to sermons about obedience. To Bransfield, Miriam was both possession and obsession. Her pale skin fascinated him, her defiance enraged him, and her silence haunted him. He wanted to own not only her body, but her spirit. He pressed himself upon her, whispered vile words, promised favors if she yielded, threatened torment if she resisted. She learned quickly that there was no safety in submission, and no mercy in resistance. Either way, pain followed. The cruelty reached its peak one harvest season when a young slave boy collapsed in the field. The sun was high, the air suffocating, and the child, no more than 10 years old, dropped his basket and fell. Jonas Pike descended on him like a wolf. He raised his whip and struck again and again, ignoring the boy's cries, ignoring his mother's screams as she tried to shield him. Bransfield stood nearby, smiling, drinking from a silver flask. Miriam, watching from the porch, felt her stomach twist. Her pale hands clenched into fists. She could not move, could not stop it, but every lash burned into her memory. When the boy finally lay limp, Pike dragged him aside as if he were nothing more than a sack of spoiled cotton. His mother's wails filled the fields. Bransfield turned and said coldly, "Let that be a lesson. Weakness is death." That night, Miriam sat in the quarters, surrounded by whispers. The slaves spoke of escape, of rebellion, of hopelessness. They spoke of Bransfield's cruelty, of Pike's savagery, but none dared act. Fear was a chain tighter than iron. Miriam listened, her pale face glowing faintly in the firelight. She said nothing, but inside her, something shifted. If fear was the chain, she would become the knife. The following months brought more torment. Bransfield took Miriam into the barn one night under the pretense of punishment. The barn was dark, the smell of hay mixed with sweat and blood. There, surrounded by ropes, pulleys, and tools, he cornered her. His hands bruised her arms, his voice dripped poison, and when he was done, he laughed, a laugh Miriam would never forget. It was not just cruelty. It was ownership, a declaration that she was nothing, a body to be used, a ghost to be mocked. But Miriam's silence was not submission. It was calculation. Every detail of the barn imprinted itself into her mind, the thick ropes, the beams overhead, the pulley creaking in the rafters. She began to see them not as tools of labor, but as weapons, instruments waiting for her hand. Jonas Pike grew more reckless as well. He began tormenting Miriam openly, dragging her into the yard to teach her place. Once, He tied her wrists with rope and dangled her before the others, laughing that ghost girl ain't got no blood in her veins. He swung her like a carcass in the smokehouse until she fainted. When she awoke, she lay on the dirt, her wrists raw, her body aching, but her mind sharper than ever. What Pike didn't realize was that he had given Miriam knowledge. She now knew the weight of the ropes, the strength of the knots, the sound of the pulley groaning overhead. Every act of cruelty was not breaking her. It was teaching her. By the autumn of 1748, tension in the quarters was suffocating. The slaves were restless, beaten down by endless labor and endless punishments. Rumors of uprisings in other colonies filtered through whispers. Stories of slaves who escaped to the north, of those who fought back and killed their masters, spread like sparks in the dark. For most, they were just dreams, quickly smothered by fear. But for Miriam, they were fuel. The breaking point came during another holiday feast. Bransfield gathered wealthy neighbors, filled the hall with laughter, and forced the slaves to serve food and wine. Miriam, carrying a tray, stumbled slightly when a drunken guest grabbed at her arm. The tray clattered, a goblet spilled, and silence fell. Bransfield's face twisted with rage. In front of everyone, he seized Miriam by the hair, dragging her into the center of the hall. He struck her once, twice, then spat. "You are nothing. Less than nothing. Even your skin betrays you." The guests laughed, raising their glasses. Jonas Pike leaned in the doorway, smirking. Miriam, on her knees, blood at the corner of her mouth, said nothing. She stared at Bransfield with pale, unblinking eyes. Something in that silence unsettled him. He struck her again, harder, and the laughter returned. But inside Miriam, the vow hardened into stone. That night, as the guests sang drunken carols and the slaves cleaned the mess, Miriam slipped into the barn. The ropes hung like waiting serpents. The pulley creaked in the rafters. She ran her hands over the coarse fibers, feeling their strength. Her eyes narrowed. She was no longer imagining. She was planning. She would not only kill Bransfield. She would destroy him in the most humiliating, unforgettable way. She would make his death a message, a warning written in blood and rope. What Miriam planned next would change everything. The night Miriam chose was a moonless one, the kind of black that swallowed sound and swallowed shapes. The plantation slept, or pretended to. Even the dogs were hushed, their chains slack. Inside the quarters, the slaves lay in uneasy slumber, breaths shallow, dreams full of shackles. Miriam moved like a shadow through that sleeping world, pale face a ghost among darker faces, her white hair braided tight against her scalp so it would not betray her in the dark. She had waited for small things to align. The harvest hands would be in the fields until near dawn. The guests from the nearby county would be lodged with their drunken laughter far from the yard, and Jonas Pike, drunk and loose-lipped, would stagger to the tavern as he often did on feast nights. The perfect night is never perfect, but it must be good enough. Miriam had learned to accept good enough. Her fingers closed around rope, sturdy, rough hemp from the barn, the same rope that hauled bales of cotton. She had memorized each knot's peculiarities, how the pulley groaned when the load was uneven, how a certain slip made the loop cinch faster. She moved with the calm of someone who had been rehearsing this act in her head for months. Not once did she think she could walk away unscarred. She intended only one thing, to make Bransfield's end an unbearable lesson. She entered the barn through a small side door she knew was seldom bolted. The smell of hay rose up, dry and sweet, mixed with the oil of the pulley. Moonlight, thin as a hair, leaked through cracks. Miriam's breath was quiet. She looped the rope around a heavy beam, testing the knot. It held. She practiced the hitch until her fingers burned, until muscle memory replaced fear. Then she waited. She watched the manor house from the shadowed slats, saw lantern light move and pause, saw figures pass beneath windows. Bransfield would return late. He always did after company. Tonight his gait would be heavier, his bladder fuller with wine and power. He would not suspect that the woman he called Ghost Girl could be the architect of his undoing. When the carriage rolled up the drive, creaking wheels and the hush of soft voices, Miriam tensed. The house hummed with the shuffle of servants. A final lamp was snuffed. Somewhere inside, Bransfield laughed, the sound like metal. Miriam tightened the loop one last time, then hid in the shadow beneath the loft. It didn't take long. Bransfield arrived, his coat smelling of claret and tallow, cane in hand, pride in his posture. Jonas followed later, reeking of the tavern, stumbling, pleased in his cruelty. Miriam watched as her master crossed the yard, heard the heavy click of his boots. He paused by the barn without looking up. Old habits made men comfortable in their cruelty. He did not see the rope or the careful noose she had placed under the beam. She stepped out, small and pale, a light against the dark wood. Miriam. Bransfield barked, surprise and annoyance twisting his features. What are you doing out here? Inside, girl. This is no place for you. Her voice did not tremble. Master, she said, the single word sounding older than her years. He laughed, a low sound, half-drunk amusement. Come then. Bring me a lantern. He meant to lead, to command. He wanted to display her, to remind himself of the body he owned and the body he could bruise at whim. Miriam obeyed. She fetched a lantern and held it at arm's length so that its yellow heart painted the barn in trembling gold. He stepped closer, smelling of wine and the arrogance of men who believe themselves gods. Jonas lingered near the door, eyes glinting with the anticipated cruelty he knew he would enjoy. When Bransfield reached the beam, Miriam stayed close, her palm steady on the cold lantern rim. He began his usual taunts, low, cruel remarks about her skin, her origin, each barb designed to make her small. He bumped the lantern against her shoulder and snatched it. The light swayed, throwing their faces into monstrous relief. Then Miriam moved. Not with the wildness of someone surprised, but with the precision of a hand that has practiced. She seized the rope loop beneath the beam and shoved it around his waist, then around his legs, working with the strange intimacy of knowledge and desperation. Bransfield cursed, surprised, angry, but his surprise made him reckless. He had been a man used to owning the weak. He never imagined the weak could seize the moment. Jonas laughed, the sound of filthy coin tossed into the air. What are you doing, Ghost? He snickered. Miriam's fingers were quick. She tightened the knot around the beam, then around him, using the pulley to hoist, the muscles she had watched and memorized doing the work for her. Bransfield struggled at first, then realized what was happening. Panic bloomed in his eyes, a red star in the guttering lamp. You haven't, no, he stammered, reached for the rope, but Miriam's hands were iron. In the confusion, a final grotesque intention took root, not born from whimsy, but from a long catalogue of violations. Miriam fitted the rope so it did not lift by the neck. She made sure the loop would find a place that would humiliate, wound, and terrify. The pulley groaned. Jonas, drunk and cruel, who had mocked hanging a man by his testicles as a joke, suddenly understood too late. They had all been too blind by contempt to see the plan unfold. Bransfield's body rose with the weight of his own arrogance. He thrashed, whiskey and panic mixing into breathless curses. The lantern crashed. The light went out. In the sudden dark, the barn filled with the sound of ropes creaking and a man's halting, terrified shriek. A breeze that found its way through the cracked siding carried the sound outward, toward the sleeping house and toward the wide fields. Miriam stood in the doorway, hands trembling not from fear, but from the force of what she had done. She had gathered years of pain into an action so precise, so humiliating, it would echo. Bransfield's cry, raw, animal, wrenched at the night. Jonas's feet pounded as he lunged forward, but the knot held. The floor beneath Bransfield was littered with tools and the broken lantern. His boots scraped uselessly against straw. For a moment, silence fell heavy, like a lid down on the world. Then there was the wet, obscene sound of life ebbing, a final breath sucked like a bad joke back into a throat. Bransfield's face, once so proud and composed during feasts, was contorted with disbelief. Jonas wailed, a high, thin sound of a man who had never imagined himself powerless. He tried to pull the rope free, but Miriam had braided its fate with sweat and skill. And in that barn, under the beam and the pulley, the slave who had been called Ghost and Spirit Child watched the man who had owned her life struggle and die in a way he would have mocked and feared. She did not dance. She did not shout. Her breath hitched once, deep and raw, as a river of relief and sorrow passed through her. She left the barn as she had entered, quietly, shadows swallowing her white braid. She walked past the yard where, even now, the distant sound of voices turned toward the barn in confusion. Behind her, the people she had lived with their whole lives were waking, pulled by the sound of the master's fall. She moved like someone stepping through a portal. The world on the other side of the barn was no longer the same as the world she had known. What would the plantation do now? Would they find her? Would they hang her as a witch? Would Jonas Pike cut her down and throw her heartless into the river? Or would other slaves seize the moment and rise with her? Miriam had not planned every consequence. She had planned one perfect blow. The ripples she would navigate as they came. As she slipped away into the night, the first distant shout rose, sharp, terrified, angry. The plantation was waking to a scene it had never imagined. The chain that had bound her life had been replaced by a rope that bound his mortality. And the shock would not end with Bransfield's death. What happened next? The frantic cries, the hasty punishments, the broken order, would erupt across the fields and quarters like wildfire. But the barn door slammed shut on one life, and on the threshold Miriam became both hunted and free. The barn doors swung open to chaos. Lanterns flickered in trembling hands as overseers, house servants, and slaves poured into the yard. The night was no longer silent. Dogs barked, chains clattered, and voices shouted over one another. Some cried out in disbelief, others in fear. But all eyes turned to the grotesque sight within the barn. Edward Bransfield, the master, the lord of the cotton fields, hung suspended like a butchered hog. His body convulsed, his face purple with strain. The rope bit cruelly, not at his throat, but at his manhood. The weight of his own body dragged him downward, every twitch another spasm of agony. His boots scraped against air. His screams, high-pitched, pitiful, stripped of all authority, split the night. No feast day hymn, no church sermon, no whip crack had ever sounded like this. It was the sound of power undone. Jonas Pike staggered forward, his drunken swagger replaced by blind panic. "Cut him down," he bellowed, fumbling for his knife. But his fingers slipped, shaking. The rope was tight, the pulley groaned under the strain, and Bransfield's body jerked violently with every desperate attempt to claw at the rope. Pike's knife glanced against hemp, barely fraying a fiber. The slaves stood frozen in the doorway, faces pale in the lantern light. Years of terror kept them still, unsure if they should rush forward to help or laugh. Miriam, pale as a ghost, stood among them. Her white hair glowed faintly in the lamplight, her expression unreadable. For the first time, they saw Bransfield not as untouchable, but as mortal. A man undone by a slave girl. Bransfield's voice broke into sobs. "Pike, help me! Help!" His words dissolved into a scream as his body swung, the rope sawing deeper. Sweat glistened on his face, tears streaked down his cheeks. The mighty cotton master who had whipped men until their backs split open, now dangled helpless, shrieking like a child. Jonas Pike roared, slashing harder at the rope. But Miriam had chosen her knots well. Every twist, every loop was calculated. It would not break quickly. And the more Pike hacked, the more the pulley swung, making Bransfield thrash and howl. The slaves began to murmur. Their whispers grew like a rising tide. Some gasped in horror, crossing themselves, muttering prayers. Others smirked, their lips curling into the beginnings of something dangerous, laughter. And a few, eyes wide, felt hope surge through their veins for the first time. One old man, stooped from years in the fields, whispered hoarsely, "The master hangs. The master bleeds like any man." His words rippled through the crowd. Bransfield heard it. His eyes bulged wider. "You dogs, cut me down." He coughed, choking on his own words. His threats had no teeth now. The whip, the gun, the ledger, none of it mattered. All that remained was the spectacle of his ruin. Pike finally turned, face twisted in rage, and his gaze locked on Miriam. "You!" he snarled. His voice cracked. "You witch! You did this!" He lunged at her, blade flashing in the lantern light. The slaves gasped, some pulling back, some reaching forward. Miriam did not move. Her pale eyes met his, calm, steady, unflinching. At the last moment, two field hands stepped between them, men who had endured Pike's lash more times than they could count. Their hands gripped his arms, halting his swing. For the first time, the overseer's authority cracked. "Let me go," Pike roared, thrashing, spittle flying from his mouth. But the men held firm, anger in their eyes. They had nothing left to lose. Behind them, Bransfield's screams weakened, turning into guttural groans. His body sagged, jerking less violently. The rope tightened with finality, creaking with the weight of a man losing his grip on life. The barn filled with the stench of sweat, fear, and inevitability. The slaves stood caught between terror and awe. They had never seen a master undone. Never seen one reduced to this. It was as if chains had fallen from their eyes. And then, silence. Bransfield's body went still, hanging grotesquely from the pulley. His head lolled, his mouth open in a final, pitiful gasp. His once commanding eyes stared blankly at the rafters. The cotton master of Virginia, the man who had ruled with whip and chain, was nothing more than a carcass swaying in the barn. A low murmur spread through the crowd. Some gasped. Some wept, whether from fear or relief, none could say. And some, trembling, began to laugh. A wild, nervous laughter that grew louder, sharper, filling the barn like a hymn of release. Jonas Pike froze, knife trembling in his hand. He saw it, the shift. Authority was slipping. Fear was not binding them anymore. The laughter of slaves was more dangerous than any blade. "Silence!" Pike screamed, his face crimson. "You think you free? You think this ghost girl brings you freedom? You'll hang. All of you will hang." He tried to rally them, to draw them back into obedience. But the words rang hollow in the air, thick with Bransfield's death. Miriam stepped forward, her voice clear, cutting through the chaos. "He is dead," she said, her pale face glowing in the lamplight. "The man who owned you, the man who whipped you, the man who sold your children, he is dead." Her voice trembled not with fear, but with power. "And he was killed by one of you. By a slave." Her words hit like thunder. The slaves stared at her, eyes wide, hearts pounding. Could it be true? Could a woman, mocked as a ghost, cast down the man who chained them? Pike pointed his knife at her, spitting rage. "She's a witch. She'll bring you all to the gallows." But no one moved to seize her. No one bowed their heads. Instead, they stood taller, straighter. Some nodded. Others clenched their fists. For the first time, they looked not at Pike, but at Miriam. The overseer realized, too late, that control was slipping through his fingers. Fear had cracked, and in its place was something he could not whip back into submission. Pike lunged again, but the field hands shoved him back. His knife clattered to the floor. The slave surged forward, not in panic, but with purpose. Rough hands grabbed Pike, pinning him to the barn wall. He roared and cursed, but his strength meant nothing against a tide of fury. Miriam stood in the center, watching, breathing hard. She had not planned this part. She had only planned to kill Bransfield. But now the night had spiraled into something greater. The slaves looked to her, not as a ghost, not as a curse, but as a symbol. She had broken the unbreakable. She had proven that masters bled, that overseers could fall, that chains could snap. And in that moment, with Bransfield's corpse swaying above them, something unthinkable happened. The slaves began to chant. Low at first, then louder. An old African rhythm, a song of defiance carried across the ocean, sung in whispers for generations. Now it roared in the barn like thunder. Jonas Pike's eyes widened in terror. He understood what Bransfield had never feared, that the slaves, united, were stronger than any whip. The climax of Miriam's rebellion was not just the master's death. It was the spark she lit in every heart. The barn was no longer a place of labor and pain. It was a temple of vengeance, a birthplace of freedom. And as the chant shook the rafters, as Pike's screams were drowned out by voices raised in defiance, Miriam knew the night would not end quietly. The plantation, the county, perhaps even Virginia itself, would feel the ripples of what she had begun. But what happened in the hours after, the pursuit, the blood, the desperate choices, would test them all. Because killing a master was one thing. Surviving the wrath of a world built on slavery was another. The barn smelled of sweat, smoke, and death. The chant of the slaves had faded into silence, replaced by ragged breathing and the creak of the rope above. Edward Bransfield's body swung gently in the dim light, lifeless, grotesque, and silent. His shadow stretched across the floorboards like a broken cross. For a long moment, no one spoke. The slaves stood frozen, staring at the master who once seemed immortal. Miriam's pale eyes lingered on him, her face unreadable. She had done it. She had torn down the man who had chained her, mocked her, and called her ghost. But the weight of it pressed down on her chest like a stone. Because she knew what came next. Jonas Pike struggled against the hands that pinned him. "You fools!" he spat, voice hoarse. "The patrols will come. The militia will burn this place to ash. Every last one of you will hang." And deep down, they knew he was right. Bransfield's death was not the end of their suffering, it was the beginning of something far more dangerous. The slaves released Pike only to bind him with rope, gagging his curses. They looked to Miriam, as if waiting for her command. She had no plan for this moment. She had only wanted revenge. But now, dozens of eyes burned into her pale skin, pleading for direction. A woman stepped forward, a field hand whose back was a map of scars. Her voice cracked. "What do we do now?" Miriam's throat tightened. She wanted to say, "Run." She wanted to say, "Hide." But she knew the truth. There was no safe place. Not in Virginia. Not in the colonies. A master killed by a slave was not something the world would forgive. The night swallowed the plantation. Word spread faster than fire. By dawn, the neighboring estates had heard whispers of rebellion. By midday, riders carried tales of Bransfield's hanging to Richmond. And by nightfall, armed men marched toward the plantation with muskets and dogs. The slaves had scattered. Some fled into the swamps, hoping the tangled roots and thick mist would hide them. Others sought refuge in the woods, moving silently, carrying only scraps of food. A few, terrified, returned to the quarters, praying obedience might save them. Miriam did not run far. She lingered at the edge of the swamp, her white hair catching the moonlight, making her visible even in the dark. She knew they would come for her. She knew she would be called the devil's child, the witch, the curse that killed a master. And yet, she did not hide. The militia came like a storm. Torches lit the night, musket barrels gleamed, dogs barked madly. The barn was set aflame, its dry timbers exploding into fire. Bransfield's body burned where it hung, the smell of charred flesh searing the night air. His death became a warning, his body consumed in fire like a twisted offering. The overseer Jonas Pike, released by the militia, wasted no time. He pointed his finger at Miriam. It was her, he roared. The albino witch. She bewitched the ropes, bewitched the slaves. His voice shook, half from rage, half from fear. The men seized her. Chains clamped around her wrists, cold and biting. She did not resist. She only stared back with her strange, pale eyes, calm as the storm raged around her. The others, those who had dared to chant, were dragged from the swamps, hunted like animals. Some were shot where they stood. Others were whipped until flesh peeled from their backs. A few were hanged from trees, their bodies swaying as warnings to every plantation within miles. Miriam was saved for something worse. She was dragged before the magistrates in Richmond. The trial was swift, the verdict predetermined. They called her a witch, a murderer, a demon. Witnesses claimed her ghostly skin was proof of the devil's mark. They said no human woman could have hanged a master in such a way, it must have been sorcery. The gallows were built high in the town square. The day of her execution, the crowd swelled. Planters, overseers, townsfolk, even slaves were forced to watch. All were told this was justice. All were told this was the price of rebellion. Miriam stood with a noose around her neck, her face calm, her white hair stirring in the wind. She did not cry. She did not beg. She looked out at the faces, at the slaves with downcast eyes, at the masters smirking with cruel satisfaction, at the children clutching their mothers' skirts. And she spoke. They chained me. They mocked me. They beat me. And still I rose. Her voice carried, steady and strong. Your master bled like a man. He screamed like a man. And he died like a man. Remember that. The magistrates shouted for silence, but the words were already planted. They sank into every heart like seeds, impossible to uproot. The rope tightened. The platform dropped. Miriam's body swung, pale against the blue sky. The crowd gasped, some crossing themselves, some cheering, some trembling in silence. The albino slave girl who hanged her master by his manhood was gone. But her story did not end there. The slaves whispered it in the quarters at night. They whispered of Miriam, the ghost girl, who proved masters could die, who proved overseers could be defied. Her name became a legend, a warning, a prayer. Years later, when other uprisings shook Virginia, when whispers of rebellion spread through the South, her story was told again. Mothers hushed their children with it. Fathers whispered it over the plow. Preachers in secret services spoke her name like scripture. Miriam, the girl who hanged the cotton master. Her body was buried in an unmarked grave outside Richmond. But her memory could not be buried. Even the masters remembered her. They spoke of her with hatred, with fear, with curses. Some forbade their slaves to speak her name. Others told the tale as a warning. This is what happens when you let a slave spirit go unbroken. But for those in chains, her story was something else. It was proof that fear could be shattered. Proof that even the pale, unwanted, mocked girl among them had the strength to strike terror into the heart of power. And in the silence of the quarters, in the hush of midnight prayers, her name lingered like a ghost. Miriam, the albino black slave who hanged the cotton master by his testicles. Her act was brutal. Her fate was tragic. But her legacy, her defiance, was immortal. And as long as the chains rattled in Virginia, her ghost walked beside them, whispering in the dark. They bleed, they scream, they die.